law is not just about lawyers anymore, and I think that lawyers have to have, in addition to a basic knowledge of the law, lawyers today need to have basic business skills, project management skills. They have to be able to read a balance sheet. They have to know a little bit about data. And I don't think most law schools are doing a terribly good job of either producing practice-ready graduates or even more so, graduates who have some of these augmented skills that I alluded to.
On today's episode of LawNext, I'll speak with Mark Cohen, founder of one of the first legal process outsourcing companies, co-founder of the groundbreaking law firm Clearspire, and now a consultant on the business and transformation of law, not to mention a thought leader through his column at Forbes and his other writings. This is Bob Ambrogi, and you're listening to LawNext, the podcast that features the innovators and entrepreneurs who are driving what's next in law. Before I get to Mark, let's hear from the sponsors who generously support LawNext. And now, on to this week's interview. Let me welcome Mark Cohen to LawNext. Mark, how are you today?
Just great, Bob. Good to be with you.
Very good to have you. I was just saying to you before we started recording, I'm going to say this on the record as well, because I am so impressed by the writing that you do. I try and keep up with your writing. You do a column at Forbes and other places, but I've spent a better part of the weekend reading back through a bunch of your columns, and I constantly find myself going through your columns wanting to highlight or underline, if I could underline on my computer screen, saying yes, yes, yes. You really get it, and I really appreciate the work that you're doing and the thought that you're contributing to the legal industry as a whole.
Well, I really appreciate that, Bob. But having said that, I hope you didn't miss the overtime periods of the playoff games because of my writing.
I did not miss. I'm in Boston. I got to watch the Patriots. So,
okay, good.
Yeah, but one of the things that struck me in thinking about this interview is the career that you've had. I mean, you've had really an amazing and diverse career in the legal field. You've been an assistant U.S. attorney. You've been a lawyer at a major firm. You've been a managing partner at a firm. You've had your own boutique litigation firm. All before we get to Clearspire and some of the things we want to talk about today. But something I did not really realize until I was looking over your bio is that earlier in your career you were the youngest partner at Finley Cumble, a firm that some of us of a certain age will remember very well as one that was seen as both pioneering for its time, but that also kind of spectacularly imploded, I guess. I wonder if there was anything from your time there at Finley Cumble that informs what you're doing now and the kind of advice that you give firms these days.
Well, I think, Bob, that's a great question. I would just simply say by way of summary that, yes, it has informed a lot of my views. I think that history does repeat itself. And 35 years later, what I'm seeing is many similarities between what's going on in firms today and what went on in Finley Cumble 35 years ago. Specifically, I think that you're seeing that PPP is king. Now, I'm going back just before the days when Steve Brill had his first, then AmLaw 250 survey of firm finances.
But profits per partner, if anybody doesn't know what PPP is.
Right. Sorry about that. But even back then, I think that origination was king. When I say we, Finley Cumble as a firm, were the first really to pick up and popularize the term lateral. There really were no laterals before Finley Cumble came along, because partners pretty much spent their entire careers with one firm or occasionally moved from a firm to an in-house position or government and then back again. Steve Cumberland and Marshall Manley, who were the co-managing partners of the firm, sort of took me under their wing for the 3.5 years that I was a partner there. And I learned a lot from them, both some things that I think were very valuable lessons in a positive sense, and some things that perhaps shaped my future legal career in terms of going off in a different set of directions.
Well, as I say, you've gone off in a lot of different directions, and we can't talk about all of it today. But I did want to talk about a couple of the initiatives that you undertook before you got to where you are today. One was that you started a company called Qualitas Legal Solutions, which was one of the first, I guess, legal process outsourcing companies. What was that, and what led you to do that? What was the need that you saw, and what were you trying to do with that?
Sure. Well, let me answer that question, Bob, by going back in town a little when I was still a practicing lawyer. I was a civil trial lawyer. I tried about 60 or so major, I guess what today would be called bet the company cases for Fortune 500 companies and 5 different foreign sovereign governments, as well as the United States government. I very early on was appointed receiver by a federal judge in the Southern District of New York to run this international aviation parts company that was wildly successful. But when it became about $100 million in arrears to the IRS on taxes, they asked me to run it. And it was at that point that I was put on the client's hat, and I basically ran the company and its legal operations across 4 continents. And I was extremely frustrated by the inefficiencies, by the inconsistent positions that were being staked out, and frankly, just by the fact that, to quote Led Zeppelin, there was a communications breakdown. And so I went to a client of mine, AT&T, and I said, hey, look, I'm having problems not only with these people, but my firm. At that point, I had started and was the managing partner of a national litigation boutique firm. I said, I need to have a greater cohesion between and among my different firm offices. What can we do? Long story short, I invested in 1991 $1 million of my own money to create what was then, I think, at its time, the first virtual law library that was in existence by a law firm. We had video conferencing between and among our offices and with key clients. We had centralized attendant, meaning that no matter which of our offices around the country you called, you got the same chirpy voice. My interest in technology and what it could do in terms of the more efficient, effective delivery of legal services is something that really traces back to 1991. So with that as kind of a long backdrop, I'll just say quickly to get to Qualitas that I took 2 years off from law, but I realized that it was sort of like the mafia. You never really totally get out. And I was in a business venture with a company based in India about the time that Tom Friedman wrote his fabulous book, The World is Flat. And I had the good privilege of having lunch with Tom Friedman and the CEO of this company I was working with. And I asked him, what do you think about some of these principles applied to legal services? And he said, well, you're the expert. Why don't you look into it? And it was about that time that my friend David Pearl and others were, poking around with Pangea 3. And so I set up with a friend of mine, an early legal outsource company that was basically document reviews, cum technology. We had people in the Philippines and we had people in India. And that's really what, kind of got me going in terms of the straight delivery of legal services as opposed to the practice of law.
So I don't want to jump around too much, but our time is limited. We got so much I want to cover, but I do want to talk about Clearspire. Clearspire, you co-founded Clearspire in I think 2010, and it was really the first of its kind. It was in kind of initiating this two company model that we're starting to see more of now. What was Clearspire? What were you thinking when you started Clearspire? What did you set out to do?
Well, actually, Bob, it was a little earlier. It was in 2008, right around the time that the ACC launched its value challenge, and right around the time that Lehman collapsed and the global financial crisis ensued. What we set out to do, basically, was we wanted to improve the efficiency in the delivery of legal services. We felt that big law certainly does a generally very fine job in terms of providing legal expertise. But my experience as a consumer of legal services and my experience with Qualitas taught me that in terms of the delivery side, the technology and the process, there was quite a bit of room for improvement, and that if one were to take out a lot of the cost escalators of traditional big law that really didn't add any value to clients, one could deliver really, really terrific services, but at a much more efficient and much more cost-effective kind of a way. So Clearspire was really, in effect, a workaround the U.S. regulatory scheme that, of course, does not allow non-lawyer investment in law firms and the like. But what started out as a kind of a regulatory circumnavigation turned out, I think, to be really quite a good thing, because it highlighted the distinction between, at least for me, the practice of law and the delivery of legal services. And so at Clearspire, we sort of separated the two, but then integrated them.
So you had two businesses, essentially.
We had
the law firm, Clearspire Law, and then you had the service company that essentially was the back end for the law firm. Is that
exactly right?
So talk about that. How did that work? How did that relationship work?
Well, so the way it worked was we developed. We started. Obviously, we put together a pretty robust business plan, because this had never been done before. I just add, that the idea, I remember having to go in front of the underwriters at Lloyd's to try to get malpractice insurance, and trying to explain this to them. I guess it helped that years ago they had been my clients when I was a practicing lawyer, but this had never been done before, and so they were scratching their heads saying, well, what exactly is this, and what's the connection between the two, and what about the regulations and stuff? But essentially, we had a group of practicing lawyers. I think the most interesting aspect of it is that they worked on a largely agile remote basis. We had a comprehensive technology platform, which we, I think, aptly called Coral, because it was a living kind of an ecosystem that allowed our lawyers, people who we would collaborate with, whether it's other providers or clients, to tap into different portals. We really, I kind of bristle at the term virtual law firm, because we did have offices, but I guess in today's parlance, you could say that we were able to, be very geographically nimble as a consequence of having technology that allowed us not only to be geographically nimble, but also very collaborative, both with other providers internally and with our clients. So the law firm practiced law, and the service company, the centerpiece of which was this $6 million ground up technology platform that took us about 2 years to construct. That was the centerpiece of the service company. The irony of it is that many people think, well, the law firm failed. The law firm didn't fail at all. It was really a matter of economics, that the law firm, was having to pay out the very significant burden of paying for what was then very, very expensive technology. Today, I'm told it would be probably a fraction of what it costs us to construct a similar model.
There was a point a few years ago, I talked to you in 2015 for an article I was writing for the ABA Journal to revive, I guess, Coral and
Yep.
perhaps market it again. Whatever happened with that?
Well, we sold it, and I think that the entity that bought it, and again, this is a little bit of conjecture on my part, Bob, but I think that at that point there was a desire to convert it into a SaaS model as opposed to, and I don't mean to get hyper technical here, but as opposed to sort of a dedicated user model. And they decided that they weren't going to go forward with that, which I think is in many ways too bad, but it was their business then. But I do think that what's important about Clearspire, well, lots of things, but one of which is not only personally the lessons that it's taught me, both as a business person, as a student of the legal industry, but also as a person, is that I'm delighted to see that there is still an interest in what Clearspire was trying to accomplish. And you had mentioned earlier, I think Atrium and other companies that in some form or fashion, I think, let's just say, may have been somewhat influenced by some of the things we tried to do with Clearspire. So in that sense, I'm very happy about that and would cheer their efforts on.
Well, yeah, and it was interesting. I mean, Atrium. When I first heard about Atrium, that was my initial reaction. In fact, I wrote a column saying, "Is this Clearspire
was it deja vu?
all over? It's deja vu all over again."
Yeah.
Yep. And it sounds very much like it. And I mean, Clearspire in its day was, it got tons of attention. It was sort of the darling of the thought leaders and the media and whatever else. I mean, it was well regarded. But it closed down 2014. I mean, you said you learned a lot of lessons from it. I mean, what would you have done different in retrospect? Is there anything you would have done different in retrospect in the way you set up or operated Clearspire?
Yeah. So first of all, I would just say, and this is not meant as a plug, but for anyone who is really interested in taking a deeper dive into your question, I did write an ebook called The Clearspire Story, which I think is as much confessional as it is, sort of a business case study. But to answer your question, Bob, what would I do differently?
I read it this weekend, Mark.
There you go. I think I should have known. The first thing, Bob, I would have done is get another partner. But beyond that, and he's a very brilliant guy, but I think, it sort of taught me that I'll get off that subject and just say, what else has it taught me? And I don't mean to be flip or dismissive. It taught me that the legal industry is fundamentally, and shame on me, I was, a cultural anthropologist while I was in graduate school. I underestimated the entrenchment and importance of culture. And I thought that legal culture could be a bit more malleable, because I thought, hey, it makes sense to me. It makes sense to some business people who I'm friendly with. It makes sense to a number of GCs. But, at the end of the day, it's one thing for people to say intellectually, I endorse this idea and I think it's great. It's another thing for them as clients to buy into a very, kind of avant-garde or revolutionary idea, especially if, they have a significant amount to lose. Lawyers and the legal industry, as you know as well as I, are generally quite risk averse. That's our training. And so I think that probably we tried to do too much too soon. And if we had taken a more incremental approach, to what we had developed instead of being perhaps slaves to the elegance of the end-to-end model, we would have been commercially far more successful.
I came across something you said about Clearspire, which I thought was a great line. You said, "It's easier to start a revolution than to win one."
Yeah. Well, I learned that the hard way. As I sometimes say, Clearspire was my $2 million tutorial.
Good. Well, okay, we've just spent 15 minutes talking about the past and way too much time on that. So I want to turn now to what you're doing now and some of the work you're doing. But let me just take a break right now, and we'll hear a word from our sponsor, and then we'll be right back to continue our discussion with Mark Cohen. All right, welcome back to LawNext. This is Bob Ambrogi, and I'm speaking with Mark Cohen, a longtime expert in legal technology, legal innovation, the business of law, and now operator of his own consulting firm, Legal Mosaic, where he works with law firms and legal departments and others to counsel them on the business of law and of what they do. Mark, one of the things that I wanted to, as I said to you earlier, I've been reading a lot of your writing and really find a lot of it really fascinating. But one of the things you've been talking a lot about is what you call the skills gap in law. What is that?
Well, in a nutshell, Bob, I use the term to describe the growing divide between what the marketplace is seeking lawyers to do and the different delivery models from which lawyers now operate. It's not just about law firms anymore or about being in-house, but there, as you know, a legion of different types of companies that are springing up, everything from litigation finance to in what I call law companies, that is companies that may or may not engage in the practice of law, but have diverse portfolios of delivery of law activities, or even the big four. So law is not just about lawyers anymore. And I think that lawyers have to have, in addition to a basic knowledge of the law, lawyers today need to have basic business skills, project management skills. They have to be able to read a balance sheet. They have to know a little bit about data and how it might be used for predictive and prophylactic and other reasons. And I think frankly, and I'm a distinguished fellow at Northwestern Law School. I am a guest professor at some other law schools around the world. And with that as by way of almost apology, I say that I don't think most law schools are doing a terribly good job of either producing practice-ready graduates or even more so, graduates who have some of these augmented skills that I alluded to.
What is it that law schools should be teaching that they're not teaching? How should they be preparing students in ways they're not doing now?
Well, for one thing, I think that there should be much more experiential learning. When I was way back when in law school, I spent most of my time clerking for a trial court judge, which is really sort of how I learned civil procedure and advocacy and all those other kinds of things. I learned from real life experience. 40 odd years later, you have a lot of people who maybe spend a little time in clinics and whatnot, but I think there has to be a lot more experiential learning. I think law schools can do a better job of, just making students aware of what's going on in the marketplace. Because a lot of the elite schools now are still, training lawyers for big law careers. The statistics say that, that universe is shrinking. I think it will continue to shrink. So I think law schools, need to do a better job, apprising people of, the marketplace and the kinds of career opportunities. There are a lot of different opportunities there that didn't exist when you and I were baby lawyers, or, much less in law school. So it's not all bad news. There's a lot of good news there. It's just that I think, you don't know where you're going if you don't know where you are. And I don't think law schools are doing a very good job of, imbuing students with the knowledge of where the profession and where the industry is.
It's funny because I used to complain about law schools not doing a good job of teaching the clinical skills, having enough clinical programs, teaching those kinds of skills. And I think it strikes me that a lot more of them certainly are doing that these days than way back when I was in law school, for sure. But what they're still not doing hardly at all, it seems, is teaching the kinds of skills around entrepreneurship, around technology, around business. I've had Dan Linna as a guest on this show, who kind of charts all of this through his Law School Innovation Index, or has been starting to chart all of this. Are there any examples that you can point to from your own experience where you think they're doing a good job of this, and what are they doing?
Well, there are two schools that come immediately to mind, neither of which is in the United States. One is Bucerius in Germany. Bucerius is Germany's first for-profit law school. When last I checked, it is ranked among Germany's very finest law schools. And their curriculum is really noteworthy in that it's 1/3 law, 1/3 technology, and 1/3 business. And the three are melded. I have been involved with Bucerius for a while now, and I can say that there's a great example of a law school that, in my mind, has a curriculum that is well suited for the 21st century. Another example could be found in Spain, IE Law School. IE is really quite similar to Bucerius in its gestalt. That is, that it recognizes that law is not somehow isolated or detached from other professions or business or technology. It imbues students not only with substantive knowledge of those three different interconnected disciplines, but it also takes a very international approach to a legal practice, which I think is really vitally important, particularly during these times. So those would be two very prominent examples of law schools that I think really get it. Of course, here, the knee-jerk reaction of American academics would be to say, well, we would love to do that, but of course we've got the ABA who, directs what we do. And that's probably true to a degree, but I think they could still, even within the parameters of ABA requirements, they could do a better job. And by the way, there's nothing to say that they couldn't lean on the ABA, as the Department of Education has done not too long ago, to say, hey, we don't think you're doing a very good job of licensure. So those would be two prominent examples.
Beyond the ABA, I mean, I think what I've often heard law school faculty and even deans say is that they're also singing to the choir, and the choir being the law firms that they're trying to hire these students. I mean, the law firms themselves aren't really demanding some of the skills that we're talking about here, are they?
Well, they're not, and that brings up, in my mind, one of the problems is that there have always been, in my mind, just strikingly sharp parallels between law schools and law firms, particularly elite law schools and elite law firms. They have a very symbiotic relationship, but I think what you're going to see is that there are some very strong parallels in terms of the way things are going to play out, because in my view, you've already seen a differentiation of a small cadre of elite law firms who have separated themselves financially and also in terms of the sort of highest value premium billed work that they do, and everybody else. I think you've got the same thing, the same dynamic going on with law schools. You've got the so-called T14, the top 14 or maybe 20 law schools who continue, to have robust numbers of applicants and whatnot, and then other law schools who are seeing declining enrollment and having to resort to some game playing with numbers and scholarships, just to meet their sort of quotas. And I think that that is going to change, and I think that law schools have just got to get real in terms of the kinds of careers that they are preparing their graduates for. And by the way, that would include, in my mind, even T14 schools, because statistically, a couple of schools I'm very familiar with. I was going over the statistics recently, and the number of graduates just in the last 3 years have changed dramatically. 3 years ago, these two schools had almost 80% of their graduates going to big law careers, or at least starting at big law, and now that number is down to 50. And I assure you, it's not because of a lack of interest in pursuing that route. It's just that the opportunities are shrinking. So I think that education is legal education in many ways is taking its cue from law firms, but you and I both know that there are still a lot of law firms that are unfortunately not taking cues from legal consumers, or at least not the way I think they should be.
Something you recently wrote about is this 2019 City Hildebrandt report, which talks about a banner year for law firms. But you've been critical of law firms for taking what you describe as a future is now approach. What is your concern with how? What do you mean by that, and what are the implications of it?
Well, what I mean by it is that it's really sort of it's just a financial reality that most firms today. I mean, there are no or very few have funded retirement plans the way firms once did, and so there is very little incentive for partners who are sort of in the waning years of their careers, to reinvest in the firm. There's virtually no financial incentive. That's not to say that there aren't some who will do it because they think it's the right thing to do or whatever. But the reality is it's more of a take the money and run kind of an attitude. I think that would be very different if law firms had more of a corporate kind of a structure where, having an interest in the firm would not, financial interest would not be extinguished when the partner, decides to retire. And I think that's part of the dynamic that law firms are just bumping up against, and it's understandable that they would take a shorter term view. But contrast that with law companies, many of which do have most of which have corporate structures, and that encourages, reinvestment. That encourages a longer-term view, and that encourages, I think, really taking aggressive, medium and longer-term approaches to what do we need to narrow the delta between what clients want us to do and what we're presently capable of doing. I think that's the big question. And I don't think that the law firm model is necessarily well suited to handle that in most cases.
So, what is your advice to law firms when you go and work with them? I mean, what do you tell them about how to break out of this pattern, if they're at all interested in hearing that from you?
Yeah. I mean, they're all interested. Whether or not they're going to do anything about it, of course, is a different matter altogether. But I think, you remember The Graduate, of course, and the famous, I have one word for you, Benjamin, and it's plastics.
Right.
That became sort of the mantra of the 60s. And I think,
Right.
if there's one word for law firms today, it's differentiate. And that's not just a word. That is sort of at times excruciating existential kind of a process of looking in the mirror and saying, who are we as an organization, and what do we do in a differentiated way that is going to justify our existence, much less kind of fill our coffers. That is a difficult thing to do because it very often requires making difficult choices and continuing to do certain things or discontinuing to do certain things you've done a long time, et cetera, et cetera. So, there's no easy fix for law firms, but I think that, there's got to be some sort of a more creative model devised which would incentivize, older and typically, largest shareholder partners to have a financial incentive to reinvest in the longer term future of the law firm. And concomitantly, I think law firms have got to, start really considering, being a little bit more intergenerational in their approach. Because I don't really see, guys my age or women my age, not many of them, being able to go to, a hot startup and to really be able to, talk the language and that resonates with them. I think you'd be much better served having a really bright younger person doing that. But again, that is just inimical to the, sort of hierarchical nature of the legal profession. And by the way, it's something that's endemic to medicine and accountancy as well. But I think these are kind of cultural changes that if I were, counseling managing partners, or if I were, God forbid, once again, a managing partner, these would be the kinds of things that I would be looking to do and focus on.
I mean, it seems that if anybody is differentiating themselves these days, at least in the sort of the larger firm corporate market, it's not the law firms themselves, but it's some of the companies that we've kind of traditionally referred to as alternative legal services providers, the Elevates or Axioms of the world. I mean, is that where the future of legal services in that market is heading?
Well, I think that they are going to definitely have a larger place in that market. I think one that I would point to is United Lex. They're doing some very interesting things. For example, they have a legal residency program that, long ago and far away, I worked with them to help to set up. They are now involved in, I think, about 10 or so different law schools. Including some, very highly ranked law schools where they, work with law students, and then very often those law students either go to work for United Lex or with other providers. They basically rebadged, a euphemism for, sort of took over about 200-300 members of DXC's legal team. They're doing some very, very interesting things. And that's not to say that the Axioms or the Elevates or other companies aren't doing the same. It is to say, to your point, that yes, I think that these so-called alternative legal service providers, some of them are anything but alternative. And I think that more importantly, their skill sets, their structure, their economic and reward models, in my mind, and their client centricity and use of data and all these other things, I think it positions them very well to continue to take increased market share. And I'll tell you that Thomson Reuters is just about to come out with its second biennial so-called alternative legal service provider report, and which I've been able to take a look at in advance, and not talking out of school, but I don't think that it would come as a surprise to anybody if the data were not to reflect the continued growth of these companies.
So such that the word alternative doesn't really apply anymore.
Yes, I think it's just become a placeholder, because for now, it's what people are familiar with. But I think, in my mind, it has a certain pejorative kind of connotation. I would not want to be called an alternative lawyer. I would prefer to be called a lawyer who does things differently. So I think that probably we're getting past time when the alternative moniker can be shed, and they're just all different manner of legal service providers, some of whom are traditional law firms, but increasingly many more of whom are not.
And speaking of going past time, I've already gone way past the time I promised you I'd have you off here. But I did want to ask you before we wrap up about your recent experience in Singapore. You did a residency at the Singapore Academy of Law in the fall, I believe it was.
Yes.
And it sounds like Singapore is really trying to do some interesting things with regard to the delivery of legal services, legal education, access to justice. Tell me what you were doing there and what you found out.
Sure. Well, my official title is Catalyst in Residence. I did not make that up. They did. It's I guess it's a fancy way of saying that they were looking for someone from the outside. Let me just take 2 minutes. I promise,
Sure.
Bob, I'll get
Take
through
your
this
time.
in 2 minutes. So
Your time is valuable. I've got all the time in the world.
Well, you're very kind. I told you before we went on air that I don't charge by the hour, so that's okay by me. So Singapore, is a very thoughtful, small nation state that punches way beyond its weight. Every 5 years, the Singapore government commissions what they call a future economy report. It's both a retrospective look back on the last 5 years of, sort of what has Singapore accomplished, and then a prospective look into the next 5 years of what can we do to continue the momentum. So the last report, and this is all public information, the last report basically concluded that Singapore wanted to find ways to leverage off of its considerable success in financial services and fintech. And it recognized that in the digital age, there's kind of a bleeding of industries, so that the boundaries between and among different industries are no longer as clearly defined as they once were. And so they identified law and accountancy as areas that they thought they could really, truly establish a regional and global footprint. Why? Well, because, it's a relatively stable nation state within the region. It's got a great infrastructure. There's tremendous amount of brain power there. It's already established as an arbitration and mediation center for that part of the world, etc. So they then commissioned a separate study on law and accountancy, and they concluded, and then I'm really grossly summarizing here, that the most important thing would be for them to get all of the stakeholders in the professional universe, that would be the government, the regulators, providers, consumers, to get together and to align and to agree to certain common joint objectives. and then they would implement on those objectives. And they determined that it would be useful to get an outsider to sort of come and, with no holds barred and no guardrails, have exposure to all these different constituencies, give a series of lectures, and then be educated, and then, sort of go from there. And so that's what I did. I'm happy to report that I'm going to be continuing this, albeit with a different role, which will be made public soon. But this isn't really about me at all. This is about the fact that I think Singapore is a fascinating place to watch, because I think what is going to be coming out of there in the near future is going to have global repercussions, certainly within the legal industry. And more specifically, and again, hoping I'm not talking out of school a bit, I would not be surprised if Singapore were not to convene a group of thought leaders from around the globe who would be rolling up their sleeves and really taking a deep and focused dive with a white paper forthcoming on the issue of, what kinds of skills, what kind of training is really required for legal professionals as well as practicing attorneys. That's just one of the things that I think Singapore is doing. It's also very involved with using technology to ameliorate the access to justice crisis, to improve legal delivery, and all sorts of related things. So it's just, I feel very, fortunate to be somewhat involved in this initiative. And it's something I think that is well worth ongoing attention.
I hate the phrase think out of the box, think outside the box, but it sounds like these entities, these organizations in Singapore really are willing to do that with respect to some of the issues that they're talking about in ways that perhaps the organized bar and some of the other leaders of the bar in the United States are not willing to do.
Bob, they're not just thinking out of the box, they are thinking out of the box, and then they're trying to build a better box. And they're not doing it willy-nilly by, throwing around terms like innovation and giving constant awards. It's just, a lot of, as my late father would say, blocking and tackling. It's hard work, as you know. Yeah. It's very hard work to create, to improve upon a system that is showing, stress cracks and obvious signs of age. It's easy to comment on it. It's easy to criticize those who are trying to do something about it and maybe didn't succeed the way some thought they might. But it's a lot harder. And I have a lot of respect for people who thoughtfully go about trying to constructively change things for the better. And they're definitely trying to do that.
Well, it is hard work, and I both you and I have been around long enough to have seen the evidence of the fact. I mean, we've seen there have been people, good people for a long time, trying to change the regulatory system, trying to change the business structure of law, trying to change other aspects of law. The education system as well, and it takes time and it takes work, and at least I do feel like we're making progress.
I share your optimism for the future, at least in this respect.
So, Mark, before I let you go, you're going to be a guinea pig because we've just launched something new. This podcast has launched a Patreon page. It's a page where people can go and support this podcast, and as part of a reward for those who choose to support the podcast, we're going to let some listeners submit questions in advance. We just launched this week, over the weekend, actually, and we have our very first question, and it was directed specifically to you. So if you don't mind, this is a question from Max Pfeiffer, who works with a company called Legal Gateway in Australia. And his question is to you: while alternative legal service providers are getting attention, big law continues to do well financially. Why do you think this is the case, and is it likely to change anytime soon?
A great question, Max. And I would say that, again, I think you have to pick your market, and I think you have to pick your apples to apples comparison, right? What law firm are you speaking about? What alternative service provider are you speaking of? I don't think we can speak in generalities. With respect to the Australian market, one of the things that I find somewhat curious is that Australia was the so-called first ABS jurisdiction, that is, that allowed law firms to go public, allowed non-lawyer investment in and management participation in law firms. And yet, it has been relatively slow on the draw in terms of embracing alternative legal service providers. That's changing. So I think that what is going to move the needle is something I wrote about just today in Forbes. I think you're going to see it happen, really disruption occur next major economic downturn. I think you're going to see a real winnowing out of law firms. And I think that you are going to see that those particularly elite, strong, well-capitalized, results-oriented, so-called alternative legal service providers really take on a bigger market position. And by the way, I would also add the Big Four into the mix. As you probably know, Max, the Big Four have been very active recently, not only in Australia, but globally. I think that, you are going to continue to see them take on a larger global market share of the quote unquote legal industry.
Well, Mark Cohen, you are the principal of Legal Mosaic. Our listeners can find you. It's legalmosaic.com, legalmosaic.com. I could talk to you for hours, but unfortunately, we've got to call it a wrap. I really appreciate your taking the time to be with me today. It's been great to talk to you.
It's been a lot of fun, Bob. Thanks a lot, and hope to chat with you again.
I'm sure we will. And that does it for this episode of LawNext. Thanks again to Mark Cohen for taking the time to be with us today. You can find out more about him and read all about him at his website, legalmosaic.com. Thanks, as always, to Ben Ambrogi for producing and editing the show. That's it for this week. This is Bob Ambrogi. See you next time.